Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to tackle something tricky. It's a tricky problem in machine learning. It's called dataset shift.
Dataset shift.
You spend all this time, building this fantastic model, and maybe it predicts, customer behavior, filters spam, or helps a self-driving car navigate. But all these models are trained on this specific data. What happens when the real-world data they encounter, it starts drifting away from what they learned? Like, what happens then?
Well, that's when things can get pretty interesting. And not always in a good way. And that's exactly what we call a dataset shift. Think about a spam filter, right? Trained on emails from years ago. It probably wouldn't catch today's sophisticated scams because spam has evolved.
That's true. It's like my old college textbooks, all of a sudden totally useless when I need to help my niece with her homework. So how do we even know when this data shift is happening? Like, how do we even spot it?
Well, that's where our deep dive comes in today. We're looking at this research paper. It's called Failing Loudly, an empirical study of methods for detecting dataset shift by Stephen Rabanser and colleagues. They really get into how to catch these shifts, before they cause these huge problems.
Failing loudly. I like that. Better than a silent failure.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So how do they actually go about detecting these shifts? Do we need some fancy new algorithm? Like, what do we have to do?
You might be surprised to learn that one of the most effective tools is something you probably already have. It's your trained model itself.
Really?
Yeah.
So the model that's supposed to be solving the problem
Yeah.
can also tell us when the data's going haywire.
Exactly.
Okay, that's pretty neat. But I feel like we need to back up a bit. Like, how do we even compare different data sets to see if they've shifted? How do we actually know?
Well, at the core of this is something called, two-sample testing. Imagine you've got two bags of marbles. Right? One bag is mostly red and blue. The other is mostly green and yellow. It's really easy to see they're different.
Yeah.
Two-sample testing gives us this statistical way to tell if these two sets of data are truly from the same source, even when the difference isn't so obvious.
Okay, so we're comparing the data, the model was trained on our source data, to the new data it's seeing in the real world, the target data, right? But machine learning often uses really complex data, not just marbles. I mean, how do you compare, like, two giant piles of images or text statistically?
That's where it gets really clever. We use techniques to simplify the data. It's kind of like summarizing, a long book into these key bullet points, right?
Okay.
It's called dimensionality reduction, and it helps us make those complex data sets more manageable for comparison.
So we're creating like a cheat sheet for the data. I get it. But I'm still stuck on this idea of the model itself being like the shift detector. Like, how does that even work?
Well, the key is in the model's output, those probabilities or predictions it generates. Let's say your model identifies cats and dogs in images, right?
Okay.
If it starts seeing a bunch of blurry pictures where it's less certain, maybe it gives a 50-50 chance of cat or dog, that could indicate a shift, even if it's still guessing correctly most of the time.
So the model's confidence or lack thereof becomes a signal. Okay.
Exactly. And the paper shows that this black box shift detection, or BBSD, is surprisingly effective. Often it even beats those fancy dimensionality reduction methods we talked about.
That's impressive. So the model's practically waving a red flag saying like, hey, something's different here. But let's say we've detected a shift. What happens next? Like, what do we do?
That's a great question. The next step is to figure out what to do about it. The research looks at two key things: identifying the specific data points that are causing the trouble and figuring out how bad the shift actually is.
So like a doctor figuring out not just that you're sick, but like what's making you sick and how worried you should be.
Exactly. They use something called a domain classifier to help with this. It's a special type of model whose job is to distinguish between the source and target data. Think of it as like a data detective, highlighting the most suspicious examples.
Okay, so the domain classifier points out the troublemakers. And then what? Like, how do we know if the shift is just a minor annoyance or like a major problem?
Well, that's where assessing the malignancy of the shift comes in. Not all shifts are equally bad, right? Some might just make the model a little less accurate, while others can lead to completely wrong decisions.
Like if my spam filter starts letting through a few extra marketing emails versus letting like a phishing scam right into my inbox.
Exactly. To determine how bad the shift is, they use this clever trick, taking a small set of labeled data from the target domain, and they see how the model performs on those specific examples. If accuracy drops significantly, That's a sign of a more malignant shift.
Okay, that's fascinating. So the domain classifier helps us understand how the data has shifted and which examples are the biggest culprits, and then we can use a small labeled set to figure out if the shift is actually hurting the model's performance. It's like a whole detective team working together.
I like that analogy. But what's even more remarkable is that they found dataset shifts, even in those benchmark datasets that everyone uses, like the MNATIS dataset of handwritten digits.
MNEST, isn't that like the hello world of image recognition? Like super simple, well-studied.
That's what makes this finding so interesting. They found a statistically significant difference in how the digit 6 is written between the training and test sets, even in MNIST. It's a reminder that even seemingly perfect data can have, hidden quirks.
Wow. So even those classic datasets aren't immune to this. This is getting pretty deep. I am hooked. We'll be back with more in part 2 of our deep dive into dataset shift detection.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
We're continuing our exploration of dataset shift.
That sneaky problem where the data your model sees in the real world, it drifts away from the data it was trained on.
And we've been talking about why that matters.
Yeah.
Because a shifted data set can really mess with your model's predictions.
Exactly.
In the last part, we talked about how two-sample testing helps us compare these data sets.
Right.
And how we can use, dimensionality reduction techniques to simplify those really complex data sets.
Yeah.
But the real mind blower for me was this idea of using the model's own output, its probabilities, as a kind of early warning system.
Yeah, that's what we call black box shift detection, or BBSD.
Yeah, I'm still amazed that the model can basically tell us when the data is starting to look different.
It's really elegant.
Yeah.
And the research we're discussing really highlights how effective that can be.
But I remember you mentioned something about assumptions.
Yes.
Assumptions. Now you've got me worried. Can you remind me what those are?
Yeah, so the paper focuses on two main types of shift: covariate shift and label shift.
Oh, okay. Those sound familiar, but I need a refresher.
Okay, so think about our self-driving car example, right? If it was mostly trained on sunny California roads, but now it's navigating snowy Canada, that's a covariate shift. The input features what the car sees have changed.
Okay, yeah. Sunshine versus snow. I get it.
But we're assuming the fundamental concept of a pedestrian remains the same, whether they're, strolling in the sunshine or bundled up in the snow.
Right. A pedestrian is a pedestrian.
Now, label shift is a bit different. Imagine training a model to filter spam, right? And over time, the proportion of spam emails, it increases. The way spam looks might not change drastically, but there's just more of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the overall balance of spam versus not spam has shifted.
Exactly. And initially, BBSD was focused on label shift. It assumes that even when the proportion of different classes changes, the model's ability to distinguish between them stays relatively consistent.
So the model's still good at telling spam from not spam, even if there's just, more spam overall.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the real world is rarely that simple, is it?
You got it.
So what happens when the assumptions don't hold up?
Well, here's the good news. Even when we have a mix of covariate and label shift, and even when the model's ability to distinguish between classes might be affected, BBSD still works remarkably well.
Okay, that's a relief. So even if things get messy, those probabilities can still give us, a valuable signal.
Exactly.
Now, remember those domain classifiers we talked about? The data detectives?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, the ones that help us understand how the data has shifted.
Yeah. So the research shows just how powerful they can be. They used domain classifiers to actually visualize the different types of shifts they introduced in their experiments.
Wait, so we can see the shift happening?
You can literally see the difference between the source and target distributions. It's not just numbers and statistics. You can visually grasp what's changing.
Okay. I'm a visual learner, so I love that. Does this help us figure out what kind of shift is happening?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like getting clues from the scene of the crime. Are the colors in the images different? Are new shapes appearing? Is there more noise or distortion? The domain classifier can help us pinpoint those changes.
Okay, so it's not just about saying, hey, there's a shift. It's about understanding the nature of the shift, which can, help us figure out how to fix it.
Now, remember we talked about figuring out how bad a shift is? It's malignancy.
Yeah.
Domain classifiers play a key role there, too.
Right, because not all shifts are, are equally harmful.
And usually we don't have labels for the new real-world data.
Right.
But to figure out how much the shift is affecting the model, we need some way to measure its performance, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. If we knew the true labels, we could just retrain the model on the new data.
Exactly. So the researchers, they use the domain classifier to select a small set of target data points that are most likely different from the source data.
Kind of like choosing the most suspicious-looking suspects from a lineup.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Oh, okay.
They get those selected samples labeled. Think of it like a targeted biopsy. And then they see how the model performs on those.
So we're testing the model on the most likely troublemakers to see how much the shift is actually hurting it.
Exactly. That small labeled set gives us a glimpse into the model's performance in the wild.
Okay. That's incredibly clever. We're using the domain classifier to guide us towards the most valuable information.
Now, let's talk about those experiments they ran.
Okay.
They didn't just talk about data set shift in theory. They actually tested these methods on real data sets and simulated different kinds of shifts.
Testing in action. I always love seeing how these ideas play out, in practice.
They used a variety of image data sets, including MNIST, the one with the handwritten digits.
Okay, we've talked about that one.
Right. But this time, they deliberately introduced shifts into the data. Things like adding noise to the images, changing the colors, rotating them, or even zooming in or out.
So they're basically throwing a bunch of different challenges at the model and seeing if these shift detection methods can catch them.
Exactly. And they found that the methods, especially BBSD, perform remarkably well across a wide range of different shifts.
That's reassuring. So it's not like we need a different method for every type of shift.
Now, one particular experiment really highlights the power of these techniques. They applied what they called a medium image shift to the MNIST dataset.
What does that mean? A medium image shift.
They took a portion of the MNIST images, specifically half of the test set, and applied a combination of rotations, translations, and zooms.
So they're slightly tilting, shifting, and zooming in or out on those handwritten digits.
Exactly. And most of the methods, particularly BBSD using those probabilities, were able to accurately flag this shift.
They caught it red-handed. But did they figure out if this particular shift was actually hurting the model's performance?
They did. They found that as the proportion of shifted images increased, the model's accuracy started to drop.
Okay, so the shift was indeed malignant in a sense.
Exactly. And that's why those small targeted labeled sets are so valuable.
Yeah.
They allow us to confirm whether the shift is benign or if it's actually, causing problems.
So it's like a two-step process: detect the shift and then assess its impact.
Yeah. Remember how we talked about the COIL 100 data set?
The one with the images of objects taken from different angles.
Right. That data set is perfect for testing shift detection because you can create shifts very deliberately.
You could take images from certain angles as your source data and images from other angles as your target data and see if the methods can, pick up on that difference.
Exactly. And that's precisely what they did.
Okay.
They split the data set in half, images from angles 0 to 175 degrees in one set, and images from 180 to 355 degrees in the other.
So they cut the circle of views, right down the middle. That seems like a pretty, a pretty clear visual shift.
Absolutely. And their methods, especially BBSD, were able to identify this shift very reliably.
So far, so good.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, did they determine if this shift actually, harmed the model's performance?
That's where it gets interesting. Despite the clear visual difference, the model's accuracy remained very high, even on the shifted data.
Wait, so the model could still accurately recognize the objects, even though it was seeing them from, completely new angles?
Exactly. And this highlights a crucial point. Not all shifts are created equal.
Yeah.
Sometimes even a significant shift might not actually affect the model's ability to do its job.
Just at that Canadian snow, right? It might make the self-driving car, more cautious, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to crash.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
And that's why assessing the malignancy of the shift is so important.
Right.
We need to go beyond just detecting the shift and understand its impact on the model's performance.
Yeah, this COIL 100 experiment really, drives that point home. It would have been easy to see that visual shift and panic, thinking the model was in trouble.
Right.
But by carefully evaluating its performance, they were able to determine that the shift was actually, benign.
Exact.
Don't panic, investigate.
Now, let's go back to those original data set splits.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about them finding shifts in MNIST, Fashion MNIST, CFAR10, and SVHN?
Yeah, even those benchmark data sets weren't perfectly identically distributed, right?
Exactly. They applied their shift detection methods to the original training and test sets provided with those data sets.
Mhm.
And what they found is remarkable.
What did they discover?
Even in these widely used, well-established data sets, there were often subtle but statistically significant shifts between the training and test sets.
It's like discovering that the foundation of your house is slightly, off kilter.
And these shifts, while small, can have real consequences. They can lead to overly optimistic estimates of the model's performance.
Right, because the model might appear to perform better on a test set that's even slightly different from the training set.
It's like practicing for a marathon on a perfectly flat track and then being surprised by hills on race day.
So even those classic data sets can have, hidden surprises.
Now, let's revisit that intriguing finding about the digit 6 in MNIST.
Ah, yes. The wonky sixes. What was the story there?
They found a statistically significant difference in how the sixes were written between the training and test sets. The sixes in the training set were, on average, rotated slightly to the right,
Okay.
while the sixes in the test set were drawn more open and centered.
I remember you mentioned a visualization, like a mean difference plot or something.
Yes, they overlaid the average 6 from the training set on top of the average 6 from the test set.
Okay.
And you could literally see the slight rotation and the difference in the openness of the loop.
So it wasn't just a statistical artifact. The difference was actually, visible.
And they confirmed this observation with a statistical test, which showed a very low p-value, indicating a high degree of statistical significance.
So even seemingly simple data sets can have these subtle quirks, right? But was this shift actually a problem?
Well, in this particular case, the shift wasn't large enough to cause a major drop in performance. Their malignancy assessment suggested it was a benign shift. But it's a reminder that we can't take anything for granted.
Right, because even small shifts can add up, especially as models become more, complex and data sets become larger and more diverse.
Now, before we wrap up this part, I want to touch on something important, the real-world implications of data set shift. We've talked about self-driving cars and spam filters, but where else does this, pop up?
It seems like something that could affect any field where machine learning is being used.
You're absolutely right. Take healthcare, for example. A model trained to diagnose a disease might encounter a shift if the demographics of the patient population change, or if new diagnostic tools or treatments are introduced.
Or in finance, a model designed to detect, fraudulent transactions might start seeing these new patterns of fraud that it wasn't trained on.
And in marketing, a model used to personalize recommendations might need to adapt to changes in consumer behavior or, seasonal trends.
So it's not just a technical problem for, for data scientists. It affects any domain where data is used to make decisions.
And as machine learning becomes even more pervasive, the need for robust shift detection methods will only increase.
Yeah, this has been an incredible deep dive so far. I'm already wondering what's next. What are the limitations of these methods, and what does the, future hold for this field?
Those are great questions, and we'll explore them in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of dataset shift detection, and I'm already feeling like a data detective myself.
I love that. That's great to hear. Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, from understanding what dataset shift is and why it matters, to exploring some pretty clever techniques for spotting it.
But like any good detective story, there's always more to uncover. You mentioned some limitations of these methods, and I'm curious to hear more about those.
Yeah, you're right. No method is perfect. And one thing to keep in mind is that these techniques, they're generally better at detecting shifts that affect, a large portion of the data. If you have a very subtle shift, one that only affects a tiny fraction of your samples, it might be harder to pick up on.
So it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Those outliers might just, slip through the cracks.
Exactly. And in those cases, traditional outlier detection methods might be more, appropriate. They're designed to pinpoint those individual anomalies rather than detecting a systematic shift in the overall distribution.
So it's all about choosing the right tool for the job. Big shifts, two-sample testing, outlier hunting, different approach. Got it. Are there any other limitations we should be, aware of?
Yeah. Another challenge is that these methods often need a decent amount of data to work effectively. If you only have a handful of samples from your target domain, it can be tough to get a reliable estimate of the shift.
Yeah, that makes sense. You need enough data points to kind of paint a clear picture of the distribution. It's like trying to sketch a landscape with only a few dots on your canvas. You're not going to get a very accurate, representation.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this can be a real problem in scenarios where you have, you know, data streaming in continuously, and you need to make decisions quickly. You might not have the time to wait for, a big batch of data to arrive.
Right, like trying to predict stock market trends or detect fraudulent transactions. You need to act fast.
All right.
So are these methods we've been discussing, are they only good for static data sets, not that constant flow of information?
That's a key limitation, yes. Most of these methods, they're designed for situations where you have a fixed set of source data and a separate set of target data. They're not ideal for the world of streaming data, where new samples are always coming in.
So we need new methods that can kind of keep up with that dynamic environment and detect shifts, on the fly.
Absolutely. Thankfully, this is an active area of research. Scientists are exploring things like online learning algorithms that can learn from each new data point as it arrives, and techniques to track changes in data distributions over time.
It's like the model is constantly, learning and adapting just like we do. But even if we can detect shifts in real time, how do we know when to actually take action? I mean, remember how we talked about some shifts being, benign?
That's an excellent point. And that brings us to another important area for, future research, developing even more robust and reliable malignancy assessment techniques.
Right, because we don't want to hit the panic button every time the data drifts a little.
Mm-hmm.
We need to know if the shift is actually impacting the model's, performance.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Researchers are exploring ways to estimate the change in model performance directly from the unlabeled target data without needing those small labeled sets that we talked about earlier.
Wow, that would be a game changer. Being able to assess the impact of a shift without having to go through the hassle of labeling data.
There's also a lot of excitement around active learning techniques. Remember, that's where the model itself can ask for help when it's unsure about, certain samples.
Right, like saying, hey, human, can you label this one for me? I'm not sure what to make of it.
Exactly. And by strategically labeling only the most informative samples, we can get a much clearer picture of that shifted data distribution without having to label everything.
So it's like a more efficient way to kind of guide the model's learning process. I like it. But I have to ask, what's the bigger picture here? Where's all this research, heading?
Well, I think it's important to remember that detecting the shift is only the first step.
Mm.
Ultimately, we want our models to be able to adapt to those shifts, automatically.
Ah, so it's not just about raising the alarm, it's about the model learning to adjust and keep performing well, even when the data is, changing around it.
Precisely. That's the holy grail of building truly robust and reliable ML systems. And that's where things get really exciting. We're talking about fields like, domain adaptation, transfer learning, and continual learning.
Wow. It sounds like we're just scratching the surface of, what's possible. I'm already looking forward to our next deep dive into those topics. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's recap what we've learned about, dataset shift detection.
Excellent idea.
Okay.
So we started by understanding that dataset shift is a very real problem in machine learning, one that can lead to inaccurate predictions and system failures if it's, not addressed.
We learned that even our own models can help us detect these shifts. Those probabilities and predictions they generate are like clues telling us when something's, different.
And we explored some powerful techniques like two-sample testing and dimensionality reduction, which can help us compare those complex data sets and identify those telltale signs of a shift.
But we also learned that not all shifts are created equal. It's not just about detecting a change, it's about assessing its impact, its malignancy, and understanding whether we, need to intervene.
And while we have some great tools at our disposal, there's still a lot of exciting work to be done in this field, especially when it comes to handling streaming data, online learning, and building models that can adapt to shifts, on the fly.
It's like we've opened up this whole new world of possibilities, but we've only, just begun to explore it.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe one of you listening will be the one to make the next big breakthrough in dataset shift detection or adaptation. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of data. Until next time, hack your data adventures.